Hi, everyone. We are Ariana and David from the Berlin Student Journal of Economics, in short BSJE. Ariana is currently doing an internship at the Institute of World Economy in Kiel and plans to continue with a master's in economics in Barcelona afterwards. I study statistics at a master's level in Berlin. This is the BSJE's first interview, and we are very pleased to have Professor Dawid here today, who will be introduced now by Ariana.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and thank you very much, Professor Dawid, for being here and having taken the time for this interview. Professor Dawid has studied mathematical methods in economics and holds the chair for economic theory and computational economics at the Bielefeld University. His research interests are agent-based computational economics, industry dynamics, and policy design in complex environments. Just to introduce it, and maybe we can start with the first question, David.
Yeah, of course, thank you very much. Professor Dawid, what made you choose this very special program, Mathematical Methods in Economics? I've never seen it before.
Okay, first, thanks for having me. Very nice to be here. So, yeah, it's a program. There are similar programs at different places, not at so many places. So it's mainly mathematics, and then you choose certain application areas. That's how it was started. I was studying at the Technical University in Vienna, and the Technical University in Vienna, so to speak, as part of the standard program in mathematics. There were different tracks which were focusing on different types of applications. So it could be more in physics, or more in economics, or more in management. And so I was always very interested in mathematics. So I really kind of enjoyed studying mathematics, but I also always had a feeling that it's good to try to apply those kind of tools, the very forceful tools that mathematics gives you to try to understand relevant problems. And I got kind of fascinated by the way these tools can be used to study economic problems. So that's how I ended up doing a lot of game theory during my studies. During my studies, I did a lot of standard mathematics, what we do, analysis, algebra, topology, which has not much to do with economics. But then you realize that many of these things are also actually quite helpful, particularly if you do economic theory. So I think for me it was a very interesting 5 years I did, and also I still profit from having a relatively good mathematical background in many areas.
Yeah, thanks. And then you wrote your dissertation on genetic learning in economic systems. That was your topic. What is it actually, a genetic algorithm, and why did you choose this topic?
Okay, so a genetic algorithm is, in principle, it's an optimization tool. So it was developed in the 1960s, or maybe even a little bit earlier, and used a lot to solve complex engineering problems and so on. So the reason it's called genetic algorithm is that it's an optimization, a heuristic optimization algorithm, which relies a lot on ideas somehow related to evolution in biology. So in this algorithm, if you have a certain problem, you generate a whole population of potential solutions to the problem, and then you evaluate them according to the objective function you have. And then over time, you evolve this population of potential solutions, and doing this, you're trying to find better ones. And doing this, you apply what is called genetic operators. And they, of course, it's not really biological evolution, obviously, but somehow they are inspired by this. So you have things like selection, and what is called crossover, which is kind of a mixing of different solutions. And then you have what is called mutation, which is kind of some local variation, or sometimes also more global mutations. So that's an algorithm that was out there. And when I started to work on my PhD, I was involved in a research project, which some of my supervisors there at the University of Technology had started, and this was about moderate rationality in economics, which at that point was a big topic. There was Thomas Sargent, who afterwards won the Nobel Prize, not necessarily for this work, but he at that point wrote a rather influential book about bounded rationality macroeconomics. And he also got interested in applying these tools, which were more from the computer science area, really. So they were called computational intelligence methods. And one of them being genetic algorithms, the others are like neural networks, things like that. By now, they have become very popular again. Some of them under slightly different names, actually. So his idea was to say, okay, I mean, in standard economics, we have these pretty strong assumptions that although we're living in a rather complex world and have to deal with rather complex environments, the individuals are pretty smart, so they are able to solve their optimization problem and find the optimal, even intertemporally optimal solution in their environment. So the question is, what happens if you kind of relax this assumption? And this is this idea of bounded rationality, which by now, of course, is kind of very popular. But this was in the early 1990s, so it was not so popular then, actually. It was quite innovative to think about this. There were not so many people doing that. There was a group at the so-called Santa Fe Institute, which were working in a similar area. When I started to work on this, someone gave me, well, not someone actually my supervisor gave me some links to papers, the way you do it, and I started to look at them, and then some of them were about the way such genetic algorithms are able to learn equilibria in certain markets. So if you assume that the individual traders on this market change their behavior according to this kind of genetic algorithm learning, what would happen? It's a very general question. If you don't assume that the equilibrium just arises because everyone is so smart, so maybe people can learn it. And then you have to make certain assumptions about how do people adjust their behavior. And one way to do it is to model this as the genetic algorithm. And so this was at that point very early work. There was an author which later became a co-author of mine, and also a good friend called Jasmina Rifovic. She had written very early papers on this, and I was looking at these papers, and I found this very interesting. I was somehow looking for an approach to get a good, in some sense also tractable model of modeling bounded dimensional behavior, and that's how I started doing this. And so being also a mathematician, I then started to try to prove certain things about these algorithms in economic environments, which at that point no one had done, and actually also afterwards pretty much no one has done. So then one of my earliest papers is about this, about trying to understand what can I say generally about this, and then in addition I was doing a lot of experiments, computational experiments in different types of markets, option markets, and what is called a complex model, so that's a very simple goods market, and so on. And I found that really interesting. So also, I think that it went pretty well in terms of the people got interested in this, and so it was a very good kind of entry for me into research.
Absolutely. Just to summarize, you would say that this algorithm helps, like it's kind of like an alternative way to describe how an agent takes decision in the model you're looking at? Just to summarize.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
So, I mean, if you do this, I mean, one natural question is this similar to the way actual people do update their behavior? I mean, that's a question which at this point was actually not really addressed. So it was just an idea to say we take this algorithm from computer science. And of course, the computer scientists have taken the algorithm mainly because it is an efficient algorithm to find a good solution in relatively complex problems. But if you're in the economics, if you use this algorithm to actually describe what you think people are doing, the main question is not so much, is it a good algorithm to learn optimal solutions? But the question is much more, is it a good way to describe how people do it? And there has been afterwards quite a bit of work of also Jasmina Rifovich, for example, with courses, where they show that it's actually a very good algorithm, something very closely related to a genetic algorithm. It's not exactly a genetic algorithm, but very similar. It's got individual evolutionary learning, this algorithm. It's a very good way to describe what you see in experiments. So if you look at human subject experiments and you see how they change their behavior over time, this algorithm is actually quite well suited to describe or reproduce, maybe I should rather say reproduce what you see in these experiments, even across different economic settings. So in that sense, it turned out to be actually a very good choice, which at that point wasn't even so clear how good it is. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think this was a wonderful appetizer for the research-related question block that comes later. But yeah, what would interest us is after your dissertation, what were the major challenges as a young researcher, or more specifically as a postdoc?
So I have to say, personally, I was pretty lucky. I mean, luck and also social networks are quite important everywhere, also in academia, I would say. So I did my PhD at the University of Technology in Vienna, and then more or less directly after that, I changed to the University of Vienna and then had a postdoc, so it was called assistant position there, which in some sense would have been already what you might call a tenure track position. So I could have stayed there, but then I didn't, because I thought it's interesting to see other things. So I went for a year with a fellowship from the Austrian Science Foundation to the US. And then I came back and was 2 years in Vienna. And then I got an offer actually to become a faculty member at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. So I wouldn't say I had a very representative postdoc phase, because I was at many different places and then didn't have a very extensive phase where I was in one place and then had to work on a certain project. So I was kind of, as I said, lucky and independent. Now, from my today's perspective, I think clearly, and of course it's true then as well, is that the postdoc phase is the phase where you really typically you don't have too many obligations apart from doing your research, and that's something to be exploited. So I think it's really the phase where you should try to develop your research and your ideas as well as you can, and try to get some visible papers out just to establish yourself as someone with a certain profile and interesting ideas and so on. And so for me, it worked well, I would say, not so much because I did a lot of planning, but because there were certain opportunities arising. And as I said, it was also a matter of luck.
Mm-hmm. And why is it that you moved again to Germany? Like you've spent some time in the United States and then you moved again to Germany. Like, is there any specific reason?
Yeah, so this was then, so I was at USC as an associate professor for 3 years. And when I went there, it was not necessarily my intention to stay there for the rest of my life. There were several factors, some of them academic, some of them also non-academic. So family related, our youngest son was born, sorry, our oldest son was born relatively soon after I moved to the US. So then there was an issue of what my wife would do and so on. So there are some things there as well. And it seemed a little bit easier to return to Europe, I would say, not necessarily before, never lived in Germany, but only in Austria and Vienna. And so this was one reason. The other reason I would say was also related to the research environment. Obviously, the US is very, in some sense, very attractive. Yeah, you have a huge density of really smart people and very strong researchers. On the other hand, it's also, at that point at least, I think it's changing a little bit. My impression was you have a little bit more freedom, what you can do in Germany compared to the US department. So, I mean, can do in a sense of that you do certain things and you still can be quite successful in doing that. And I think in that respect, US is a little bit more streamlined, also in terms of which topics you should work on and so on. And so I did not like that so much. And also, yeah, it's a matter of a little bit of your networks. The academic network has been in Europe mainly, also at that point, of course, I was living some ties also here. So there was a mix of things where in the end I thought I will just try and see what happens. So I applied to a few positions in Germany, and then, yeah, Bielefeld, I think for me was a very good match because traditionally it has been a department very strong in game theory and dynamics, which were two things I was very interested in. So I think, again, it was actually quite lucky for me.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your answers. We can then switch to the next part because our answers on your personal career, I like our questions are just we just went through them, and I can ask you the first one regarding Neoclassics. In particular, when you started, let's start from the beginning. When you started as a young researcher, how did you perceive the discussion about Neoclassics and standard economics? And did this actually impact your career in any way?
So when I was starting, as I said, I was starting in a project which was explicitly about bounded irrational behavior in economics. So in some sense, it was clear that this is not the standard neoclassical approach, where you assume that there is, at that point, it was even a little bit more narrow than of course it is now, that you have models with rational expectations, perfect force set, etc. And then of course full rationality. I always thought about this as being very useful, actually. So I have also myself, I mean, I've been writing papers where I'm fully neoclassical and dynamic equilibrium models, actually quite a few of them. So my take on this is that if I'm given that the economy is so enormously complex, clearly if we want to do any kind of modeling, we have to reduce complexity a lot. And then there is a question of what is the question you have in mind, what's the question you want to address. and what is the appropriate way to look at this question. And so I always thought it's actually complementary to do this in a very neoclassical way, where I would say it's for me personally maybe more in normative theories, so what individuals should do, not necessarily a descriptive one in the sense of what they do. And you obviously can learn a lot from trying to understand what they should do and what are the incentives at work and how does the interaction result in maybe counterintuitive incentives and so on. And so in that sense, I think it's a very useful tool to think about economic problems. At the same time, I also think that in some areas, it is important to try to understand, in particular also on a more aggregate level, maybe industry macro level, to understand what is the implication if people don't do it, because I think we know from experiments and so on that they don't. So, and then the models become very complex, and you have to start to think how do we describe this non-rational behavior. And there I think a lot of work still should be done. In particular, I would say maybe more in the macro area.
Yeah.
It's getting there. Macroeconomics for a long time, we used to have almost only models with rational expectations, but now it has become very common models for people who don't have rational expectations, where you have heterogeneous expectations and so on. So I think the field is moving. But I never, I mean, in particular in the agent-based community, there is also a certain group which is kind of arguing that it's not a very useful way to use these perfect rationality assumptions to do economic modeling. I'm not really a fan of this type of argument, because I think you learn a lot from that as well. And I think it's important to understand what these models do, but I also think it's important to try to think about what's happening if we relax those assumptions. So that's a little bit my general perspective. I don't see this huge kind of controversy there.
We're already able to hear from you how your modeling approach differs from Neoclassics. So I would like to ask a more specific question. Or as far as I know, or I recognized, why are approaches considering nonlinear dynamics and chaos so rare in economic research these days? Because this is a topic I'm personally quite interested in. And I wondered why, because in the 90s, I found way more articles about that.
Yes. So I think that this huge wave in the 1990s was based on a very kind of fundamental insight, or very fundamental point that this literature was making, which was that if you, so many economic models, apart from having equilibrium and having perfect rationality and so on, at that point it was also that you were looking essentially at linear models. And if they were not really linear, you were linearizing them, and in some sense it's still done in some areas, right? So you look at the equilibrium, you look at the linear dynamics around it, and so this somehow had the connotation that if we are in such a world of rational behavior and people are sufficiently smart and forward-looking, the system tends to be stable. And these early nonlinear dynamic and chaos papers made the point you can have so to be perfect this standard model where everyone has nice, well-behaved, concave, whatever utility functions and is doing all the things that in these dynamic equilibrium models you expect an economic agent to do, which is being optimal in the behavior, having perfect foresight and so on, that still the dynamics can be extremely complex, not necessarily stable, so that you can get this this hard to predict behavior, that this is not necessarily due to some external shocks or whatever, but that can in principle emerge endogenously from a very standard economic setting. And so I think this was a point which was made, and it was made in all kinds of economic environments, and then of course there was a lot of research going on exactly under which conditions you can get that, and then maybe under some you can't. But my own perception is that at some point this point had been made in all possible ways, and that it was not so obvious what is, so to speak, the follow-up implication of that. So I think this was a very successful literature, but in some sense maybe it exhausted itself by making this point. I mean, it's still, I mean, there are of course many people working on nonlinear dynamics in economics, and actually also on these agent-based models. At the end, they are nonlinear dynamic models, but the reference to chaos theory in particular also, if you want to do some analytical things on that, you need relatively low dimensional, relatively simple models to say much about it. And here I think it's hard to publish papers now if you can't make a fundamentally new, generate a fundamentally new insight about this. Because I think by now people say, okay, we know you can give me another economic environment and provide a model where you show, oh, there is chaos. But in some sense, we know that. It's not so easy to say something fundamentally new, is my impression. So that's why I believe it has become a little bit less visible. I mean, there are very, very productive groups who do a lot of work still on this. I mean, it's not only about the behavior, it's also about what is called basis of attractions. So if you have a model where you have different locally stable equilibria and you ask the question, from which initial point do I get to this or to that equilibrium? So there's also work showing that actually this can also be quite complex, the structure of this basis. Which then means that you really have very strong dependence on the initial condition determining where you go. So this has to do with this concept of path dependency and so on. I think there is a lot of work still, but I would share your impression that the heydays maybe have been some time ago.
Thank you. Now I understand it better.
Yeah, we're talking a lot about assumptions, and this is also something you've been working on a lot. And I actually have a question on this. I'm actually quite interested in assumptions and how you model an economic environment. You wrote a working paper in 2018 regarding agent-based macroeconomics. My question would be, could you please explain to us and to the audience kind of like the assumptions of an agent-based macroeconomic model compared, for example, to a standard dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model?
Mm-hmm.
And why is it that you preferred, because it's clear you prefer the first one, the agent-based model?
Yes, I mean, obviously I have expertise in the first and in the second. Yeah, so what are the assumptions? As far as the economic environment as such goes, so production functions and so on. I think there is not necessarily a big difference. I mean, there are different models which make different in that respect. What are the inputs at different factors and so on. But I think this is not really what distinguishes these types of models. So some of them are very similar in that respect. So if you look at the agent-based model, focusing, for example, technological change, structurally they are actually not very different from what would be more or less standard endogenous growth model. Things. So the crucial difference, I would say, is in two respects. So one is that in an equilibrium model, a DSG model, or there are different variations, of course, of this. You typically cannot represent a large degree of heterogeneity between agents. So it's no longer true that these models work with what was long the main workhorse, the so-called representative agents, so that you say you have one firm representing all the firms. I mean, many of these models, you do have some heterogeneity, but it's relatively restricted what you can allow as dimensions of heterogeneity. And often, of course, that there are heterogeneities arising endogenously, and you might not necessarily know ex ante what are the implications of the heterogeneity, for example, with respect to skills or other things, for other important economic variables, income, maybe also the duration of your tenure at certain firms and so on. So I think the flexibility of what you can capture in terms of heterogeneity is one big difference. So in an agent-based approach, because you're defining, so to speak, what is the input to the decision rules of the agent, and you're much more free to do it because you're less restricted by tractability concerns. Equilibrium model, you still have to solve it. So if you do DSG and you use Denari and so on, you can, by now, the computational power is of course, has gone up a lot. So you can do more than you could do 10, 20 years ago, but still there is a restriction there. So I think that's one point. But the main point from my perspective would be that if you look at the problem the individual in such a model is facing, it's a very complex problem. And so the key point is how do you determine the behavior of this agent? And I think there is where the crucial difference lies. So in an equilibrium model, you would assume that in principle, the agent understands the structure of the economy and is able to really say what their own action today will mean for tomorrow and the day after tomorrow and so on. And that's, of course, a strong assumption. You can discuss how good an approximation this is for what actual agents will do. The agent-based approach is to say we try to find foundations directly from observable, empirical, experimental, whatever behavior, what people, decision makers in such an environment would do, and try to put that into the model. And that typically yields a model which is not practical analytically. So then the implication of that is you need to simulate. And I think that's, for me, the main difference. And this has an advantage, of course, because you can be more flexible in what you do, but having the opportunity to be more flexible also can be a disadvantage. So there is this argument that then you are in what is called the wilderness of bounded rationality. So you can, of course, design any model that you want with any kind of behavior rule you put for the individual agent. The question is, so what is the relationship between the model you design and actual behavior of agents in the economy? So that's clearly a concern. On the other hand, I think there has been a lot of work done trying to provide foundations. So like we have developed an agent-based macroeconomic model where the approach we are following is to say, for example, for firm behavior, the decisions the firm makes in our model is exactly the decisions firms have to make every day. So like future planning of capacities, how much you want to produce, how you want to price, and so on. And if you actually teach operations management, which I did for a while, you don't teach the students, oh, you need to understand exactly what is the dynamic structure of your market, but you teach that there are certain relatively well-established heuristics. So simplified models of the world, if you want, and that you derive your behavior from these heuristics. And so we, for example, try to put heuristics like that into the model.
Okay, thank you. Maybe another question on this topic still. You wrote in the same working paper that there is a lot of heterogeneity of assumptions, like a lot of research on this, but a lot of different scientists and researchers, they structure their models differently. Yes. So we could say that's kind of like, yeah, did this scare you somehow? Do you think that that's an issue?
Yes, I definitely think it's an issue. Yes, yes. So, yeah, coming back to this is comparison also with modeling behavior as intertemporally optimal versus boundedly rational. I mean, one of the big advantages of assuming that decision makers behave in an intertemporally optimal way is that this gives you a unique prediction. So if you make this assumption, then it's clear what is the decision this individual will take, because there's only one intertemporally optimal action, typically. There's another question that you can calculate it, but given that you can calculate it, it's unique. And whereas if you try to model a boundedly rational behavior, clearly it's not unique. And one of the problems I see also in the field, so one of, let's say, the challenges, maybe the better word, is to try to be more standardized. There are different ways, and there are good ways to motivate different types of behavior rules and different types of approaches to model how boundedly rational individuals would behave. But of course, it makes comparison of results, for example, much more difficult. So if you have a standard model and everyone is using the same model, then if you examine what is the effect of, let's say, a certain text, then it's clear if you compare your paper to another paper where this text was not there, that the difference is the text. And if you have now two agent-based models and the models are already somehow different, and one has this economy without the text, the other one with the text, it's much harder to be very clear on what is actually the reason for the differences in results that you see in the two papers. Is it that because they make slightly different assumptions about the behavior, or is it because it's this text? So I think standardization is very valuable and would be good to have more also in the agent-based literature. So some years ago, together with a course of Domenico Delegati, I wrote a relatively long handbook article where we tried to systematically compare at least the main families of these agent-based models, and this was exactly the idea, to get a little bit more transparency, who is actually doing what, and how is this related. Yeah, I don't know. This has been a discussion in the agent-based community for a long time. Not so easy. It's a self-organizing system. So if people don't particularly like your assumptions, they're not going to use your model. I think it would be desirable. It would be good to have a little bit more standardization, but we'll see how this evolves. Yeah.
When one looks at your publication list, it becomes obvious that you seem to concentrate more on economic theory during the more recent years than back in the 90s, as far as I understood the titles and papers. Is this standardization issue you just mentioned a reason for that, or did it arise from your experience in economic theory?
No, honestly, I wouldn't even see it that way. So of course, there are always there's some stochasticity, which depends on which kind of projects you're working on, with which courses you're working on. But I've always been essentially working on agent-based model at the same time, also on models which are, as I said, very standard theory, game theoretic models, and so on. And so, yeah, if you look at the publications, this might be a little bit lack and left in that wet pointers. So I wouldn't say that I've been shifting my attention from agent-based to theory, but I try to do both. And as I said, I think there is also really complementarity. First, personally, I like to do both, and second, I also think there's something to be learned from these different approaches. Generally speaking, pure theory in economics is, I would say, a little bit harder to sell, if you want to put it that way, than it used to be maybe 20 years ago. And that, I think, is sometimes also very understandable and good. So in the end, it's an empirical science. So I think there has been a movement that it's very desirable to link your theory with some empirical evidence that the theory you're putting forward also can explain certain things that you see in the data. And of course, there is way more data available now, which makes this more feasible to do compared to years ago. I think both is important. It's important to have a theory to try to understand what you see in the data, but then also important to try to see, okay, this very nice model, this very nice theory, can we actually learn from it in a empirical setting and then do very well. So and by the way, I do see agent-based models also as theorizing. It's a different way. It's not an analytical way of theorizing, but it's theorizing.
So before we come to our two final questions, because now where we're talking about, do you think today's decision makers or policy advisor actually care about very recent economic theory, or do they listen not before there's some empirical evidence, for example?
Okay, I guess it depends a lot on the politician. I think there are some who are maybe more open and interesting to hearing, generally speaking, hearing advice from economists than others. So there has been, I mean, it depends also on what you mean by recent. So I don't think you can expect that if there is a paper published today, that this will have an impact on policy in the next 2-3 years. I think it is too fast. But there have been some kind of developments in economic theory who have been, I would say, quite influential also in how markets are designed. So if you think about, it was a little bit long ago for auctions, but then also the work by Roth, for example, matching markets, which were actually used to organize kidney exchanges in the US and so on. So that was initially very kind of real theory work, right? And then it had strong implications also for applications. And one more, maybe more recent example that would come to my mind is the issue of systemic risk. So after the financial crisis, where there was actually very little work before seriously talking about it, and then I should say, coming back to the agent-based models, that one of the very few papers that had seriously considered the contagion, potential contagion effects that kind of the failure of individual firms and banks might have on the macroeconomy were agent-based models, because they could kind of incorporate those mechanisms, which in a standard model was very hard to do. But by now there is a large literature on how to measure, how to understand the mechanisms underlying systemic risk. And I think this is taken rather seriously by people like central banks and so on, who have to be concerned about that. So I think there is some impact. Not every theory, I think, has impact on policy, but maybe ex ante also hard to say what will become the relevance. So we have to working on systemic risk in 2005, and many people were not super interested because everyone was thinking, oh, we have no problem there. Everything is under control. So why would we care so much about systemic risk? And then all of a sudden it becomes very relevant.
But like, yeah, maybe on this, it seems that that we are stuck in the same ideas, and it seems like it's a bit about the same theoretical background sometimes in the political debate. This so my question would be, do you think that the methodologies since the start of your career, do you think that the methodology to do research or did those methodologies change, but the topics stayed the same? What happened?
So clearly methodologies changed. For example, the huge literature by now on behavioral economics based on lab experiments, and now it's more moving to field experiments and so on. So those are methodologies. When I started my career in the middle 90s, I mean, there have been, of course, experiments before, but it was a very small field at that point. And all of a sudden, it became extremely influential, and now it's one of the most successful areas in many parts of economics. And also now, again, now we're moving from the lab to the field experiments and so on. So I would say methodologies change in that respect. Also, this has implications, of course, for theory. I mean, by now there are, of course, theories trying to understand better what we see in those experiments. Think about it as different type of preferences, or also developments where we try to take into account that there's something like uncertainty, so kind of serious uncertainty, which you cannot simply quantify as a probability distribution, but you have to look for other ways to deal with this, like ambiguity models and so on. So yeah, I think methodology is changing. Topics are also changing, so I think both are changing. I would say, I mean, there are few cornerstones like what we discussed before, the equilibrium assumptions and so on, that I think many economists are kind of don't think it's a good idea to give them up. But I think otherwise, yes, a lot of new types of models and approaches have been developed. It's changing all the time. So, I mean, if you continue doing what you did when you started as a postdoc, that's not a good idea in the long run, for sure.
Very good to hear. Now we've come to the final question that we somehow want to establish as a tradition also for future interviews, and that is, which advice would you now give a student considering a career in research?
Well, first, you should really be convinced that what you're doing is important. So I think it's really important that you have fun by what you're doing, that you think is the coolest thing you could do is work on these issues. I think that's important. At the same time, it's maybe also important, let me say, that you don't get completely swamped and just day and night think about your model or what you're working on. That's also important to keep a look at the balance, obviously. Yeah, you should really be convinced that you're doing what you want to do. At the same time, for young researchers, I mean, I've been working a lot with many different students. You can see a lot of heterogeneity in the way also different people approach this kind of exciting project of writing an own paper, for example. So it's important that you feel that's an important question. At the same time, it's also important to not reinvent the wheels or not get kind of carried away by saying, oh, I want to do everything completely different than everyone has done so far. So to really be embedded in the literature, try to understand what people have done and how you can kind of build on this and expand it. So I think that's my main advice for like in the short run, writing your first papers and then talk to people. I think that's also very important. The best feedback typically you get if you discuss with someone who is kind of knowledgeable about this field over coffee or so. So that's important. More on a more broader scale, I would say if you want to be in research, it's important to be flexible, and particularly flexible also geographically. Now, one of the I mean, the German system has advantages and disadvantages. I would say clearly one of the disadvantages is that there are no, well, there are not no, but still the tenure track junior positions are not easy to get. So if you start your career, you will be here for a few years, most probably somewhere else for a few other years. And I think it's also a good idea to think in advance whether you would be willing to go abroad and to just do what's sometimes needed to continue your academic career. That's also one advice I typically give to PhD students if I talk to them about whether they want to continue after their PhD. In academia, if you're not flexible in that respect, you need a lot of luck, I would say. Can still work, but in a certain phase of the academic career, and I would say that's maybe from 4 years after your PhD up to when you might get a tenured professor position, the German system is just not the best. So I think being willing to go abroad. Apart from that, I think it's also a very good experience, and it's good to be exposed to different systems and different cultures and so on. Anyhow, but if you just abstract from this, just in terms of your career planning, I think in some senses maybe the right time to very seriously consider to be somewhere else. But it's always heterogeneous. It depends, of course, on the individual circumstances and so on. So I'm not sure whether you were what kind of advice you were expecting, but that would be my advice, both for how to try to find what you want to work on and how to do it, but maybe also to think about, do I want to stay in academia or not? But having said that, so this maybe is now sound a little bit too negative. It's a great life. You do things that's interesting, not all the time, every day, but sometimes it's a privilege to work on things that you, to a large extent at least, choose yourself. And you meet many interesting people and so on. So I think it's worth to take some risk if you really feel that's what you want to do.
Thank you very much for all these insights. And thank you very much for taking the time. It really has been a pleasure, and I think this was a great first interview to start the series.
Thank you. So I hope it's
really
partly interesting.
It was super inspiring. It was super inspiring. Thank you very much, Professor Dawid. It was very nice to ask you this question.
Thank you. So wish you all the best with the journal.
Thank you. Thank you a lot.
So
thank you a lot.
Keep me posted.
We definitely do.
We'll let you know. We'll send you the link as soon as we publish everything. And yeah. Okay. So we can end. I think we can end our interview.
Yes.
Right now.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.